we are back, and today is all about the number one question I get in my comments. This isn't something that anyone has ever directly asked me or put in a poll or anything like that. Not that, whatever. Anyways, people ask me in the comments all the time how I come up with my ideas, especially since they are very collage style, surreal, random kind of shit all piled together in a way that I hope makes sense for the most part. So how do I come up with that? Realistically, how I come up with my ideas is the same way I get inspired. So once I've felt like that kind of sudden moment of inspiration, it usually comes from a single subject. So in the case, if we want to talk about my most recent piece over here, the horse, the carousel, was my initial idea. So it actually just started there. And I can show you in one of my original drafts that it really didn't look the way that it ended up looking. One sec. So my original draft for this one, my most recent piece, again was centered around the main subject. So going with that guy, the little carousel. So my original sketch, bear with me because all my sketches look like this. You will never see any of my sketches look any cleaner than this. This is what it looked like. So, a miracle that it ever turns out to anything beyond this, but this is what it started with. So we have the carousel, and the carousel was the main subject. You can see in the center of the piece here, we still have the fishbone, which ended up actually being behind the length of, or the width of the carousel. And then we have some random shit. We have a bow, which ended up being in there. We have what would become the outlet plate. The reason I'm going on this little tangent is it starts with one idea, and it doesn't always look like that. So let's talk about that for a second. We use that initial subject to set the stage, right? So you have the horse. Now what? Essentially, you want your main subject, whatever you want your eye to draw into, that's going to be the focal point of your piece. So everything that you have outside of that should make sense with the subject. And it can be tricky, especially if you're like me and you tend to use juxtaposition. So for example, we have this really soft pastel carousel, and then we have it mixed with these kind of more technical, darker, cool tone. I mean, actually the whole thing is pretty cool tone, but we have this kind of opposing theme, right? We have these horses, this carousel, this kind of nostalgic childhood, whimsical kind of thing, and then we have this more technical, wiry, everywhere kind of thing. So the vibe essentially is always going to go around that first thing, right? We're going to use what we know about the subject to inform everything else. What that means is you're going to use symbols, right? So for example, we're looking at this, we know that a carousel is not just a carousel in art, right? People have memories associated with whatever it is that they've experienced with carousels. They associate it again with childhood, they associate it with maybe memories of going on one, being with family. Maybe they have kids and they have memories of their kids going on a carousel. Whatever, they're not just for kids, I guess. But the point is that we have these things in our lives that hold inherent meanings more universally than not. So we know that this is going to be something that we associate with carnivals or amusement parks or whatever, or fairs, doesn't matter. There's an association. We also know that we associate computers with things like cables, futurism. We have this idea of a little bit more cold, a little bit less warmth that you would get from maybe the idea of a joyful carnival ride. So knowing that you have symbols and knowing that symbols hold weight in the process of interpretation, we can use those things to add to the piece. In practice, let's talk about that, right? So I have the carousel, we already talked about the symbolism. What is this thing here? So that is a mock computer screen. On the computer screen, we have Sisyphus pushing up the rock. What the fuck does that mean? Well, Sisyphus, if we know the story, his eternal punishment was to push a rock up the hill, and every single time the rock would fall again, you have to start over. Whole idea. So where does that link? Where does that link? Well, what do carousels do? Right? They go around and around and around and around. So that's the association that I made. This idea of carousels being repetitive cycles that don't change, like the Sisyphus myth. In terms of this entire piece, not that this is really entirely relevant, but the whole point of this entire piece was about repeating old cycles. So we're using things like childhood, especially older mocks of technology. We have an older calculator here, things like that, to enforce this idea that this is dated. We have old, worn, no longer functioning pieces of technology that are in there, to talk about this kind of like repetition that is inherent to growing up. We have cycles that we should probably break that we don't. So yeah, that's what I used to create that messaging. The next thing is to always choose colors intelligently. So again, I mentioned the colors earlier, right? We have the warm, not warm per se, but we have the pastel cool tones. We have the purples, the blues, the pinks, pinks being a little bit warmer. But actually in this piece, they have a blue base. So they're going to give more of that like icy kind of vibe than maybe a regular pink would. And I did the same thing for this piece here, where it has a blue base, because I didn't want it to be so like wee, like fun and whatever. And that's so fine if that's the case for the messaging, but that wasn't the case of the messaging. So we went with the cool base. I wanted to again juxtapose it with something like the coldness of technology, something that is maybe a little bit less first of all, something that shows its date, because technology will always show its date. We know, we watch a movie and we see someone with a fucking BlackBerry and we know it's from 2013 or whatever, when, these things are cultural icons. They mark time, they mark advancements. And so it's really, really easy to associate these things with a timeline. The point is that when I did that, I wanted to make sure that I was using very, very rich greens. And I also want to make sure that I was using colors that still tied in with my original color scheme, because this actually had nothing to do with technology when I planned it, as you saw. It had a fish and a horse. That's it. The point is that you want to use colors that enforce one another. So we're going with this darker kind of like hunter forest green that you normally will see in a circuit board. In the circuit board, we're going to use things like gold, because we know we have a gold plate. We know we have a gold stand here. We know that gold makes sense to be in a circuit board. And yeah, so you're just going to make sure that when you come up with your ideas, your colors enforce that. And that's usually like the number one thing for me when I'm doing a draft. Let me show you. So if you look at this initial sketch, still super great and clear, and you know exactly what's happening. But you can see that the color scheme is not exact, but it's pretty fucking close. We have the pink, that's what matters, and we have the pastel, and we have some of these darker greens, we have the screen. We know what is going where and why. And the blue was just because I liked the periwinkle. That's it. And it matched. So just making sure that you're making sense of all these things as they're being incorporated. Yeah, so another point that I had written down in advance when I want to talk about like exactly how I come up with my ideas is not being too stuck on your original idea. As you saw, my original idea is hardly there. If I were to show you my original idea next to this, you could be like, oh, carousel, fish. But really, like, there wasn't a computer involved there. None of that nostalgic messaging was there. None of that. There wasn't even a color scheme for that. And then the second draft, the one that I actually used to create this piece, didn't even have most of what was going on. The point is, you need to be open to changing vision, because I find, at least myself, that painting reveals more to you than you to it. Like, I'm not informing this is informing me. I'm starting with the vibe that I like and the feeling that I want to get out. But this whole messaging of childhood and technology and all that stuff, that came during, right? The cables, none of that was planned. That came during. So you need to go with the flow. You need to be open to a changing vision. And when you come up with your ideas, let it be based on something fluid. So again, what is the root of the symbolism? Again, how can I depict the message in 100 different ways that make sense? Especially when you're doing mixed media, you have to be open-minded and you have to be able to articulate thoughts with a variety of mediums and a variety of symbols. Yeah, that's pretty much it. How do I come up with my ideas is a process of what makes sense to me, what memories are attached to what images are attached to maybe more general memories, what other people might associate with these things. But more importantly, like, let it all speak for itself when you're coming up with an idea. Like, I don't come up with something again and say, like, this is the messaging I'm intending to put out. It's a vibe. I liked the carousel. I like that carousels make me feel a little nostalgic, and everything kind of came in around that. I'm not sure how helpful it is to say such a general kind of sense of like coming up with ideas, but it comes back to the same thing with like finding inspiration. You can't force things in mixed media, especially more abstract contemporary art, like you can with realism. And with realism, it's great because I can say this is what looks like this, and this is what is that, and this is, I'm depicting exactly things as they are, and I'm using the laws of light and depth and proportion, all of these things to show you something. I'm using a whole whack load of random things to show you something more literal with a whole bunch of nonsense. So yeah, come up with your ideas just as organically as they come. And they'll make sense to you in the way they make sense to you, and they'll make sense to others in the way that makes sense to them. I'm sure only a fraction of you got the vibe that I was like setting out to depict. If I tell you this is what it means, you might be like, oh, I see that. But in reality, you have already created and crafted your own sense of meaning, your own sense of understanding, and your own sense of what this could be for you and for me. You've decided, and that's okay with me because it's probably pretty close, at least in terms of the vibe. But yeah, when you come up with your ideas, just start with one thing. When I was in grade 3, I had this teacher. She very much informed my art in the sense that she said to me, start with a line. Start with a line. What she meant by that was don't let the initial hesitation take over the practice of figuring it out as you go. Don't let the hesitation of the final image or that apprehension you might feel in terms of like, can I do this right? Can I show this right? Prevent you from making that original line, from making the second line, from making the horse, then making the computer, and going from there. Because that hesitation will prevent you from coming up with the idea. Because the idea it doesn't need to be fully formed. Start with what you have, figure it out as you go. And that's it.